This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with scholars, researchers, writers, or simply people who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. I am now joined on the line by Roberta Ronsethal Kwall, a legal scholar and the founding director of the DePaul University College of Law. She is the author of the new book, The Myth of the Cultural Jew, Culture and Law in Jewish Tradition. It was recently published by Oxford University Press, and she's now joining us. Hello, Bobby. Welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me and giving me an opportunity to speak with you about my new book.
It's a pleasure. So let me start with a slightly provocative question. There are so many people, non-practicing Jews out there, who define themselves as cultural Jews, that is, people who distinguish between belonging to a religion and belonging to a culture. Why is the cultural Jew a myth then?
Well, I'm laughing. I'm really laughing because over the Chag, over Shavuot, one of my fellow congregants at synagogue came up to me and said, "Did you see the new review of your book and commentary, which just apparently came out? I hadn't even seen it." And one of the points that the reviewer makes was, she does a great job of showing the intersection between law and culture, but B, the idea that cultural Jews are somehow motivated by Jewish law in their culture, he wasn't as convinced about that. So your starting point is sort of the same question that you're asking me, and I think, and so I've been thinking a lot about this, since the wee hours of the morning when I actually read his review. So I think for me, I think one thing that is not generally understood about Jewish law in broader terms, and this is true among scholars, secular scholars, even some Jewish law scholars would reject the premise, and certainly by the lay population. And this book is directed to both scholars and lay audience, is that, first of all, the idea that law is not this objectified system that simply has dropped, and in the case of Jewish law, that has dropped down from the heavens. That is not how law generally works, and that is not how halakha works. And that notion in and of itself is not intuitively apparent to many, many Jews. Certainly, there are Jews on the right end of the spectrum. By the right, I mean the religiously right end of the spectrum, that would completely reject the idea that culture has any influence in the formation, not the application, but the formation of Jewish law. But on the more progressive end of the spectrum, the idea that Jewish law, which is probably seen by many, I don't want to use the word secular Jews because I think that has a different context in Israel and even in the States, but by Jews who would not consider themselves religious. Right. Okay, so the idea
non-practicing, it's the most straightforward
Jews, or even Jews that are practicing, but not according to Orthodox. Not according to an Orthodox practice. Okay.
What about Jews who don't believe in God?
Or Jews that don't believe in God, of course.
Oh, they fall under that category for you.
Absolutely. And by the way, there can be Jews that don't believe in God that are very, very religious and observant. They like the way of life. Certainly that's a phenomenon that we see here in the States. And my guess is, that may be also something that you can find in Israel as well when push comes to shove.
Exactly.
Because as you know, we're a religion of practice. It's the practice, it's what you're doing that is largely furnishing the markers.
Yeah, so how does it feed into culture? That's if it's practice on the one hand, which is very important in Judaism, and the slightly more amorphous, perhaps a realm of culture and ideas, they are at the end of the day very closely linked.
Exactly. And that's the premise of my book. And so in and of itself, the idea, again, that Jewish law has been shaped by human hands over the millennia, that, number one, would be a revelation to many people, because most people are not thinking about Jewish law in those terms to the extent they think about it at all. Okay, so that's the first thing. But on the other side to that, because of that reality, because you cannot separate the law and the culture, they are really so intertwined. Even those Jews that do not think of themselves as being religious in a way that orthoprax would suggest religiosity. There's a basis in halakha and in the Masorah, the tradition, for what these Jews are doing, even if they don't realize that basis because they're not necessarily knowledgeable, about Jewish law, but it still has shaped their practices.
Can you give an example, perhaps? I don't know. I'm thinking about the perhaps most heretical Jews out there. I don't know. Perhaps those who led the communist, the Bolshevik party in Russia, or those who disavowed any kind of Jewish religiosity. What were the elements in their worldview as Jews that you think were fed by halakha?
Okay, well, first of all, and I do want to make an important distinction here, especially a distinction that's relevant in the U.S. When I'm talking about a cultural Jew, I am talking about a Jew that is still identified as a Jew. Mm-hmm. Whether the parties you mentioned would still identify themselves as Jews in the way that I'm speaking of, I can't really say for sure.
So what is exactly the way you're speaking of? Because it's someone who just says, is it a voluntary thing? I'm part of the Jewish collective. How do you draw the line?
Yeah, first of all, this is a very gray area. That's one of the points in my book. It's not black and white. It's gray. So you can't really draw lines. But somebody who, again, in the United States, there's been much discussion about the Pew Report, which was the most comprehensive study of the American Jewish community. It came out in 2013 while I was writing this book. And so what I would say to answer your question is I would include the people who would say that they are either, to use Pew's terms, Jewish by religion. Clearly, that's the case. Even if they're not Orthodox, but they're Jewish by religion. You say, what is your religion? They will say, I'm Jewish. Okay, or those Jews who would not say that they are viewing Judaism as a religion, but they consider themselves Jewish, okay, and that was the second category.
Yeah, Jews of no religion, as they were known in the Pew Report.
Yes, the Jews of no religion, exactly. Mm-hmm. And so my points are really relevant to that group of people. If someone is completely unidentified, disaffiliated, and I'm not talking about denominationally affiliated, but just not opting into Jewish peoplehood at any level, I'm not talking about that group of people, because that's beyond the pale of the group I'm talking about. I'm talking about the many, many, many Jews here in the States, and again, there's an analog in Israel, but as we'll hopefully discuss, Israel is a different situation for many reasons. But there's many, many groups of Jews in the United States who say, I consider myself a cultural Jew. All right. And what they don't realize is they have been shaped.
Okay, so what are the elements in the halakha that shape them as cultural Jews, even though they are non-practicing and even Jews of no religion?
Okay, so I'll give a couple of examples. Some ritualistically oriented and some non-ritualistically, or some behaviorally oriented beyond the ritual. Okay, on the ritual side, many Jews will have a Passover Seder. Many, many Jews will have a Passover Seder. They may not go through the Haggadah in its entirety, but they certainly mark off time to spend on the first night of Pesach together with their family. They cook special foods, they prepare. The same is true with Hanukkah. Okay, many Jews, according to Pew, even if they're not religious, surprisingly, they fast for all or part of Yom Kippur. They may not be doing this to observe halakha. They may not even be thinking that there is a legal basis for what they're doing. It's not in their minds, and that's the point. Well, that's one of the points of my book, that because the law and what has become Jewish culture is so intertwined with one another, people are actually observing the tradition or parts or pieces of the tradition, even though they don't recognize it. So that's on a ritualistic end, I would say. Another thing I would say to add to the ritualistic part is here in the States, the celebration of B'nai Mitzvah is very, very common, and people may not go to shul regularly, but oftentimes, if they're in a Jewish community, they're going to find themselves in shul at some point during the year to celebrate a bat or a bar mitzvah of a neighbor, a friend, a colleague, etc. So those are some examples. But beyond that, more behavioral examples. The idea of tzedakah. Yes, many people do good deeds, give charity, etc. But I think the art of tzedakah is one that is very much culturally prominent, among Jews. You have the whole, here in the States, the federation system. There are a lot of quote-unquote cultural Jews that are affiliated with the Federation, and they're not religious, but they really staunchly support what the federations do.
Yeah.
And that idea of tzedakah comes directly from the Torah, leaving the edges of the field untouched for the poor, for the widows, etc. People don't necessarily know the link between that. But I think, again, that's why I hope that my book is somewhat provocative to them, because it's like a light bulb will go off and they'll say, oh, I get that. Okay, that's a really interesting connection. I never thought about that. Similarly, as a lawyer myself, I've often wondered, why is it that there are so many Jewish lawyers? I mean, if you think about it, there are some professions that are highly represented by our people, and law is certainly one of them. Again, if you go back to the dialectic of Jewish history over time, so much of which has been influenced by Talmudic discourse and what goes on the pages of the Talmud, it's not surprising that Jews would gravitate in their cultural DNA toward a legal type of framework. So those are the more amorphous examples of the more amorphous connection between Jewish culture.
Would you say, Bobby, that this is a particularly Jewish phenomenon, or is it just predominantly Jewish?
That what is a particularly Jewish phenomenon?
The link between the religious elements and the cultural realm.
Well,
wouldn't Christians be fed by a similar, perhaps a kind of unperceived connection to their religious roots? I don't know, for example, just like you said that Jews of non-religion celebrate the Passover Seder. I mean, there are some non-practicing Christians who celebrate Christmas and perhaps go to church from time to time. How is it different to the phenomenon that you're describing that relates to Judaism?
That's an excellent question, and it's actually something I've been thinking about a lot lately, the notion of cultural Christianity, right? And I think there is something to the question of cultural Christianity. But first of all, Christianity is, as you know, it's broad. I mean, Christianity can include, fundamentalist Protestant Christians as well as Catholics who have a legal system that is somewhat, not completely, but somewhat more similar to Jewish law. And that there's that, tradition of canon law. I think the difference is, you're quite right. There are many, and I know many Christians who even the term Christian suggests that you have some sort of affirmation of faith in Jesus Christ. And if you don't have that affirmation of faith, you're technically not considered Christian because you don't have the affirmation, but they're culturally Christian. They celebrate. Or
even just people who are born into a Christian household without ever practicing the religion. I mean,
exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's exactly right. And it's true, there are certain traditions, and Christmas being perhaps the biggest one, the Easter egg hunt being another one that's considered, they're more family-like traditions. In that regard, Okay, in that regard, you can say there is a general similarity. But I think what goes on with Judaism and Jewish law is very, very different. And why? Because Jewish law, halakha, is an organic legal system that covers virtually every aspect of human behavior. It touches on all forms of life. And because of that, and because there's been this human component to the development of Jewish law, it has influenced our people, for millennia in terms of how they think and how they practice. And it's intangible. It's not black and white. Again, you can't put your finger on it, but I think it makes it very, very different from Christianity.
Now I'd like to take you perhaps to a different place and ask you a methodological question. The practice of cultural analysis is a somewhat common scholarly tool in the field of legal studies. Can you tell us a bit about it in broad terms and perhaps come back to this particular study about how it is applied in the case of Jewish law?
Yes, certainly. Well, cultural analysis is a method of looking at law that has become particularly popular, I would say, in the last third of the 20th century. Again, there'd been a notion that any law is a subjectified system, 1 + 1 = 2, and that, it developed in sort of in a vacuum from any cultural influence. I would say toward the end of the 20th century, particularly with the emergence of a few legal phenomenon. Number one, the narrative movement in law, where law is seen in legal circles, not just as the rules, but about the stories of the people behind the rules. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the emergence of types of scholarship in law that are being done really by what we call outside scholars, and this typically includes women, racial minorities, gay legal theory, and many of these outside scholars actually rely on narrative as well. But a lot of this was basically surfacing, I would say, in the last third of the 20th century, so that law is seen not as a cut-and-dried system, but as a product of culture. And so there were people that were actually looking at secular law in that way. Yeah. Now, from my perspective, I have always looked at Jewish law, or halakha, as a reflection of the culture. In other words, I grew up in what you call in Israel the Masorti movement. Okay, here in the States it's the conservative movement. I've always looked at Jewish law sort of as in positive historical terms, namely that it's kind of, I do believe, just for the record, I do believe in the divinity of the law, and I do believe in the divine origins of the law, but I believe, personally, I've always believed God has painted in a broad brush, and that it's up to humans and human beings to fill in the blanks of more details. And by the way,
as indeed they have done for the past 2,000 years or so.
Exactly. And by the way, Menachem Malone in his 4-volume treatise on Jewish law essentially said, that the Torah is here on earth. It's not in heaven, right? Yeah. So it's not, what I'm saying is really not, it really is very consistent with how Jewish law has always been understood to operate. The problem, of course, from a sociological standpoint, is the more interpretation, the more you allow for human involvement, the more it's seen as a less objectified system, the more you have the potential for that slippery slope, that concept that we talk about in law that can be the undoing of the system. And I'm very cognizant of that. So that's how I've always viewed Jewish law in my head. I realized maybe about 8 years ago that there was nothing being written about halakha that specifically applies the cultural analysis methodology to halakha. Part of the reason for that is that most of the people in the legal academy that are doing Jewish law work are really looking at Jewish law more from a yeshiva-based perspective, and they're focused on questions like, what is the Jewish law on, copyright, or what is the Jewish law on marriage, or, they're looking at those kinds of questions where you can actually participate in the give and take of Talmudic discourse, applying it to a particular
and you've taken a bird's eye view of the whole thing.
I'm basically looking at it at a macro level, exactly. Yeah. And so I'm looking at it as a legal system. And as a result of that, it's very clear to me that applying the insights of cultural analysis, and again, cultural analysis, you talk about absence of black and white. Cultural analysis is very murky. It's very messy. It's very gray. When I first started this project, I had to slog through many, many books and articles on cultural analysis just to get a handle on what that exactly meant and how you could apply it. Okay. So there are certain key elements, I would say, that are found in the writings of those who look at law in a culturally nuanced way, which is the way that I look at law and generally and halakha specifically. So what are some of those ways? Well, again, given that cultural analysis is consistent with the views of outside scholars, as we just discussed, one of those ways is that law develops in response to the views of those in power. In other words, those who are making the law, those who are in the power, that have the seat of power, are going to have their views more, shall we say, prominently represented in the discourse than those who are not. So that's certainly one factor of cultural analysis. A second factor has to do with the law being contextual. Law develops in particular cultural environments. That's why the laws look different in different areas. Yeah. And so that's another factor, or that's another application of cultural analysis. And with that, it's also contextual, and it's historical. Again, the environment also is represented just not geographically, but also chronologically, at different periods of history.
Yeah. I'll have to cut you off here and perhaps move to the last question, because we're quickly running out of time, I'm afraid. Sure. We did talk about the American context of your work, but one of the chapters in the book is about Israel, which, as you said in the beginning of our conversation, is a very dissimilar, very different case. Can you describe how your analysis plays out in the Israeli context?
Yes. Israel is, I'll tell you briefly why it's different, and then briefly why I think Israel can also be viewed as sort of a model for what I'm talking about in the States. So why is Israel different? Israel is different, obviously, because the majority of Jews in Israel, even if they're secular and not religious, are still living in Jewish time in a culture in which they are the majority. And you can't underestimate the significance of that distinction. Mm-hmm. So that's number one. Number two, Israelis speak Hebrew. And so they have an access to the sources, the Jewish sources, in a way that the vast majority of American Jews
in theory.
If they choose to pursue the sources, they can understand. Right, they can understand them. Although biblical Hebrew obviously is somewhat different from conversational, it's still
and at least from my impression is that very few do, but that's a different question.
Right, but they would have the access to if they do. And again, living in the majority culture, you also are not facing the same types of threats to the dismantlement of peoplehood that we have in the States. And here I'm talking about intermarriage specifically. It's different. The realities are different.
Absolutely.
Having said that, though, it is my understanding that there's a lot of spiritual searching going on in Israel, even among secular Israelis. And there have been a lot of, would you agree with that? There's a lot of recent phenomenon in Israel that represent this spiritual searching. Secular Israelis are learning more, even with traditional sources. There's things such as the Kabbalat Shabbat in Jerusalem, and there's a movement in Tel Aviv that is basically focused on sort of celebrations of
it's called
culture.
Jewish renewal here.
Jewish renewal, exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's a interest in Jewish renewal, and there's also the idea that's propagated, in some ways by Jewish elite in Israel, that Israel is sort of like the microcosm, the laboratory for Jewish peoplehood and Jewish life and Jewish civilization, even if you're not adhering to a strict adherence to halakha. And that's been promoted by institutes such as the Hartman Institute.
Yeah.
and others who believe in that type of pluralism, religious pluralism. So I think part of that can be used as a model for the states. Okay, but in the States we have to work a lot harder because we're dealing with a probably deeper degree of ignorance, and clearly we've got the assimilation issue, and we have the intermarriage issue. And so part of the point of what I'm trying to say here is, especially to the religious community, I'm trying to say, look, don't underestimate the power of cultural identity. Don't write off those Jews because, frankly, they're important to the mission and the survival. And to the liberal end, I'm trying to say it's great that you feel culturally identified. It's great that you do a Pesach Seder or whatever else you're doing, but you have to understand that there's more to it than that, even in terms of what you're doing, because that is based on this wonderfully rich tradition that you have to be part of as well, and you have to know, you have to have the knowledge to be part of it. So I'm really got a message for both sides of the table.
A very convincing one, and I have to say that on this optimistic note, I'm really happy to wrap up Professor Roberta Ronsethal Kwall, the founding director of the DePaul University College of Law and author of The Myth of the Cultural Jew, Culture and Law in Jewish Tradition. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me today.
This was the Tel Aviv Review for this week. Thank you very much for listening. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.